Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Keelah Williams. She is an assistant professor of psychology and director of Jurisprudence of Law and Justice Studies at Hamilton College. Her research explores how the perception of threats and opportunities in the environment may shape stereotype content, punishment strategies, and legal decision making. And today we're going to focus on that, particularly stereotypes and how people think about criminal behavior, and toward the end, probably also a little bit about friendship. So, Dr. Williams, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, what is a stereotype, just to begin with?
Sure. So stereotypes are beliefs about an individual that's based on their group membership. So, for example, you might have a belief that Australians like to party, and you meet me, and I'm Australian, so you think, oh, Keelah likes to party. But this is a good opportunity to point out that stereotypes can be very wrong. In fact, if I wrote a biography, it would be 100 Years of Solitude. So, I am, so stereotypes are not always correct, but they're these beliefs that we have, inferences that we make about people that are based on their group membership.
So, this might be a complicated question, but where do they stem from?
Stereotypes are basically coming from our efforts to try to understand our social ecology, so the behaviors of the people are around us, so that ultimately what we want is to be able to manage the people around us, to be able to take advantage of opportunities and to help to mitigate any threats that might be posed to us. And so we stereotype because we need to very quickly and to some degree of accuracy predict the opportunities and threats that are going to be posed by other people. And it's important that we can rarely directly perceive the kinds of goals and capacities and strategies that other people are going to adopt. And so we have to infer them from perceivable cues. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're stereotyping.
So, do they have an evolutionary basis? And if so, how should we understand them from the perspective of, in this case, evolutionary psychology?
Yes, so stereotypes definitely do have an evolutionary basis. The reason why stereotyping is so pervasive, it's so ubiquitous, is because for our ancestors, there were certain regularities between these perceived features of others and their behaviors. And so people who use these regularities to then make inferences about others, or so essentially those of our ancestors who stereotyped, would have then interacted with other people more effectively, and that would have enhanced their reproductive fitness relative to those who did not stereotype. So yes, I would say that stereotyping is an adaptation. But again, that doesn't mean that it always leads to perfect inferences. It's going to be an imperfect process, one that inherently involves overgeneralizations. And while there might be a evolutionary basis for stereotyping, that doesn't necessarily mean that the content of the stereotypes that we hold are all going to be innate.
So, I mean, there are certainly different kinds or categories of stereotypes, right? I imagine that we can say there are stereotypes regarding sex slash gender, age, race. Of course, we might get later into the question of if all of them are really biological or have a biological basis or not, but there are different categories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are nearly infinite categories of stereotypes that we stereotype people on all different kinds of dimensions. When we use different features, like you mentioned, age, sex, race, even temperament or musicality, for example. But we do think that people should categorize others in ways that will help them to make useful inferences. So the category dimensions themselves aren't entirely arbitrary. Like, for example, we don't typically stereotype people on the basis of the length of their earlobes or the color shirt that they wear, because that wouldn't give us very much useful information about the likely behavior of that person. So we tend to focus our stereotypes on those features that have some diagnostic utility for the behavior of that individual.
Mm-hmm. And so, what would be the categories or domains of stereotypes for which there's good evidence that they might have at least a biological basis?
So I would argue that sex and age are perhaps the clearest example of this. And I personally would argue that ecology is another fundamental dimension that we use to stereotype people, but I'm sure we'll get to that a bit later.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Could you give us some examples of common stereotypes people have regarding sex and age?
Yeah, so some of the stereotypes that have been the most well studied with both sex and age have to do with agency, being agentic, and being communal. So the extent to which you are an independent person and you like your independence, that would be agency. And then to be communal would be to get along better with other people and to care about those social relationships and so forth. And so there's a lot of previous research that has shown that women tend to be more communal and communally focused than men, whereas men tend to be more agentic than women, and younger people tend to be more agentic than older people, and older people tend to be more communal than younger people. So that's the sort of basic evidence that has existed so far in literature out there, but the direction that I'm sure we're heading is talking about sex and age stereotypes and how there is actually intersectionality of sex and age. So we shouldn't be thinking just about how do people stereotype men and how do people stereotype women. We should instead be thinking about how do people stereotype young women as compared to older women, young women as compared to young men, elderly men, that we should be looking at the junction between age and sex rather than just at age and sex stereotypes alone.
Mm-hmm. And what information do we get from looking at that junction instead of just the two different domains apart from each other?
Great question. So this is work that has been primarily done by my colleague Oliver Sung, and I've had the opportunity to work with him on this research, but he is the lead author on this work that we've done together. And essentially what we have argued together is that our stereotypes of people exist at those age and sex interactions rather than at the independent categories. So you don't make the same inferences about a young man that you make about an old man when it comes to important kinds of stereotypes, like, for example, their mating goals, how interested they are going to be in short-term mating, right? You're smiling because it's pretty obvious that there's going to be a difference between whether you're asking about an 18-year-old guy or an 80-year-old guy on this question. And the same is true for communality, that actually, if you ask people how agentic or communal a young woman is, she's stereotyped as being almost as agentic as a young man. It's only at older ages that you start to see that separation between older women being perceived as much more communal than older men.
Mm-hmm. And what about, and this is a very sensitive subject, but what about race-based stereotypes? Do they have any biological basis at all? And of course, this is not the same question as asking you if race has some biological reality to it, but the race-based stereotypes themselves.
Yeah, you're right that this is a very sensitive question, and it's a very interesting question from an evolutionary perspective because humans have only interacted with people of different races with any regularity relatively recently in terms of our evolutionary history. So for a long, long time, we wouldn't have interacted with people of other races. So there wouldn't have been a selection pressure for a psychology that's sensitive to race. per se. But on the other hand, we know that people do stereotype by race. It happens. So then why? Why would that be so prevalent if it's not something that we would have evolved to do? And my response is that perceivers might be using race as a heuristic cue to a more fundamental dimension like coalition or ecology. So we do stereotype on the basis of race, but it's being used as sort of this proxy for another variable.
So you've been referring to ecology several times. What role does ecology really play in the development or the evolution of stereotypes? And I mean, what are ecology-driven stereotypes, for example?
So I think first it's important to define what ecology is, what I mean when I use that term. I'm specifically referring to environments on the basis of their harshness and their unpredictability. So environments vary on how resource poor or rich they are and how they experience random fluctuations in environmental conditions, like are there lots of hurricanes and droughts, or is it relatively stable? So that's what I mean when I say an ecology is an environment that varies in its harshness and unpredictability. And we know from a bunch of really great research that's been done that the type of ecology that someone lives in does influence the way that they behave. So, for example, people who live in more, and I should also interrupt myself to say, it's not just people, it's also animals. This is applying across species, that we see these effects, that those who live in harsh and unpredictable environments are more likely to reach sexual maturity early, for example, and more likely to be impulsive and risk-taking than individuals from these more resource stable and predictable environments, and so forth. So you get a lot of really rich information about how an individual is likely to behave if you know something about the environment that they grew up in.
Let me just interrupt for a second. What you're referring to there has to do with life history theory, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So for listeners who don't know anything about life history theory, just quickly, it's a biological theory that suggests that organisms have a finite amount of energy that they can allocate across different fundamental tasks like growth, mating, and parenting. And the resource allocations that they make will depend in part on the kind of ecology that they live in. Because you can imagine that if you are from an ecology that is very harsh and unpredictable, that you wouldn't want to invest a lot of resources taking a long time to reach sexual maturity, like invest all your resources in growth, because if you do that, you run the risk that you might die before you ever get a chance to reproduce. So it'd make more sense to put more of those calories into reaching sexual maturity early so that you make sure you reproduce before you die.
Right. Yes. And were you about to say anything more about ecology and how it relates to stereotypes, or?
Yes. So I think I left off saying ecology gives all of this information about how a person is likely to behave. Well, if it's giving all of this really rich information that is useful for making inferences about people's behavior, then social perceivers, people, should be attuned to cues of ecology in other individuals, and they should use that information then to make predictions about how that person is likely to behave. So when I say ecology-driven stereotypes, I mean inferences about a person's behavior based on the presumptions about their ecology.
Oh, so we have evolved to process this kind of information, I mean, to try to predict or consider how people would behave in different types of ecologies. Is that it?
Yes. So ecology should be information that we are attuned to, and we should then use it in our stereotypes of other people. And so in work that I've done with, again, Oliver Sung and Stephen Newberg, who was my PhD advisor, we have been studying whether people do in fact possess these ecology stereotypes. So if you tell people to imagine a person who is from an individual where jobs and opportunities are scarce and money is scarce, then how likely is this person to be impulsive, to be sexually unrestricted, to engage in criminal behavior, to invest in their children, and so on and so forth. And we find, first in the United States, that people do have these ecology stereotypes, that they stereotype people from these harsher ecologies as being more impulsive, more risk-taking, more sexually unrestricted, less likely to invest in their children, less likely to be educated, and so forth, as compared to people from more hopeful, resource-rich environments. And then in work that we've done since then, we look to see if we found the same pattern of results in other places around the world, because ecology stereotypes shouldn't be constrained to the United States. They should exist anywhere that you see variation in ecology. And so we looked in Japan and Romania and India and the UK and among others, and we consistently find the same pattern, that people stereotype individuals from these more desperate environments as having what we would call faster life history strategies than individuals from hopeful ecologies.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when people study stereotypes, there's also a bunch of research on stereotype accuracy. Do you have any idea if the accuracy of the stereotypes is important from an evolutionary perspective? I mean, is it that we have evolved to try to develop accurate stereotypes, or is that not really important, or it might perhaps serve other social functions, for example?
That's such a great question. So stereotypes only need to be accurate enough. So they're not designed to be perfectly accurate. And in fact, in some ways, they're designed to be inaccurate, but in predictable directions. So what I mean by that is that we tend to overgeneralize when it comes to threats. So we're more likely to say that someone is dangerous when they might in fact not be, than to make the other error of thinking that they're not dangerous when they in fact might be. And so our stereotypes are calibrated in those kinds of directions, where we're more likely to stereotype someone as likely to be a threat as compared to not, because it's more functional for us to make that mistake. And so I wouldn't say that stereotypes are accurate, especially not when it comes to any one individual, because obviously you're talking about overgeneralizations about groups, and so it's never going to perfectly define an individual. There is likely to be a kernel of truth in stereotypes, otherwise they would serve no purpose. But we do expect them to have inaccuracies, but likely in predictable directions.
Mm-hmm. And there's also, I'm not completely sure or can't remember exactly if this is the correct term, but there's also individuating effects. That is, if we are exposed to a person from a group about which we hold particular stereotypes and that person does not really behave according to our preconceived ideas, let's say, then we many times do not treat her as if she was like the others, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You are 100% correct that we take individuating information into account, and we're more likely to do so when motivated for some reason to go beyond our stereotypes to understand a person better and to get better and better information that allows us to predict their behaviors. So maybe we care less when it's someone that we're not going to interact with very much, and so a basic stereotype will serve us just fine. But if it's someone that we are going to interact with a lot, or we have other motivations for understanding them better, then we're less likely to rely on those stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. And how does stereotyping connect to prejudice?
So stereotypes, again, refer to the beliefs. They're the cognitive part of it, that we believe that an individual is going to act a certain way because of their group membership. Prejudices refer to the affective, the emotional component. And they connect with one another because the belief that you have about someone is going to elicit a particular emotional reaction to them. So, for example, if you have a belief, a stereotype that gay men carry disease, then that could lead you to feel disgust. And then that felt disgust can lead you to discriminate, which is the behavioral component against that individual. So behave towards them in a particular way. So you have these different beliefs that themselves lead to very different emotional responses. And so when we talk about prejudice, we're actually talking about prejudices in the plural, that these emotions that we feel are qualitatively distinct, and they are brought on by the different beliefs that we have about the individuals or the groups they belong to.
Mm-hmm. So, apart from helping us sort of navigate our social world, because of course it's not always possible to individuate every single person we interact with, and it's important for us to at least try to predict how the other person will behave according to their age, sex, and how we should behave toward them. Do stereotypes also serve other social functions? Like, for example, if we share common stereotypes with a group of people, are we signaling something or not?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I do think that you could make an argument that a shared stereotype could improve group cohesion. But I'm not familiar with research done on that. I mean, it certainly may exist, but I'm not familiar with it. I'd be really interested to know if it promotes group cohesion.
Yeah, fair enough. So tell us about the affordance management approach to stereotypes. I read about that in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with the premise that human beings are highly social animals. We live in these very dense, interconnected social networks. And so our ability to achieve our own goals depends in large part on our ability to manage the goals and behaviors of other people. So when we talk about affordance management systems, we're talking about the psychological mechanisms that are designed in order to help us to identify threats and opportunities, and then to react to them in functional ways. So affordance management is recognizing social threats and opportunities, and then behaving in ways that minimize the threats and maximize the opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Changing topics now a little bit and talking now about emotions. How should we understand them from an evolutionary perspective? Are they adaptations, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So emotions can be thought of as these superordinate or controlling cognitive programs that help to coordinate and guide cognition and behavior in response to particular adaptive challenges. So the different adaptive challenges that an individual faces are going to elicit very qualitatively distinct emotions. So what an evolutionary perspective on emotions says that's very different than other perspectives is that we shouldn't think about emotions as being just positive or negative, but instead we should think about them as being qualitatively distinct. So fear and sexual jealousy, for example, are both negative emotions, but they have very different purposes and are associated with very distinct cognitive and behavioral profiles. So an evolutionary perspective on emotions is interested in understanding, what is the function of the emotion, what is the adaptive challenge that's associated with eliciting the emotion, and so forth.
Mhm. Could you explain what is a mediation context and how emotions apply there?
So mediation is a particular form of dispute resolution. So in an American legal system, you have the court system, which is the very traditional way where you have, two parties who hate each other and they each want to win, and so only one of them can, and they're head to head on some issue. And mediation is very different. It's sort of a precursor to going to court, that instead the two parties get forced to sit in a room together with a neutral third party whose job it is to try to get the two parties to compromise. So to come to some kind of agreement, at some resolution where they don't actually have to go to court. And maybe the hope is that this resolution will be something that will be satisfying to both of them, and maybe both of them will get something good out of it, as compared to court, where someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. So when I was at Arizona State University, I was in a joint law and psychology program, and as part of the law side of my training, I worked as a volunteer mediator in the court system. So I was that third party, the neutral third party, who would sit in the room and try and get these two people who hate each other to try to agree on something. And that was where I came up with the idea of applying an evolutionary approach to emotions to this context of mediation, because I thought it would be a very useful approach of thinking about what can we know from an evolutionary perspective about, or what can we predict about when certain emotions are likely to be expressed, what are the kinds of things that are likely to elicit those emotions, so what are the precipitating events, for example, and then what's likely to appease particular emotions. And so I was focused primarily on the emotion of anger. And there's really interesting work by Aaron Sell on a recalibrational theory of anger. I'm sure you have chatted either with him or with others who have spoken about.
Yes, I've done an interview with him recently. The date we're recording our interview on, it's not been released yet, but it's going to be soon. So.
Oh, well, that's going to be fantastic. People, I'm sure, are really going to enjoy that. His work is so interesting. And he has argued that anger is essentially a program that tries to get others to recalibrate how much weight they are putting on the angry person's welfare. So I get angry to let you know that you're not placing enough weight on my welfare, and you need to shape up and change and the way that you're treating me. And so I have, in the article that I wrote, talked about how we can use this recalibration theory of anger to better understand when people are likely to get angry in mediation and what's likely to help them to not feel so angry. Mm-hmm. So what is it that you can do to depress people's anger once they're experiencing it? And then we can ask similar kinds of questions for other emotions, like shame, for example, which Daniel Sneezer has talked about as being related to how others value or devalue the self. And so shame is something else that might come up in a mediation, and what is it helpful to know more about what's likely to produce it so that you can better, more effectively manage it when it happens.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Daniel Sneezer, another person I've already had on the show. So, so if people are interested in his work, go check his interview out. So, and how do people develop their perceptions of criminal behavior?
So this is work that I am really, really excited about. It's related to a paper that is just coming out now. I just sent in the final revisions to the journal, and so it's going to be published as part of a special issue on evolution and law. Sorry that I'm plugging this special issue on your show. I hope you don't mind.
No, not at all.
But it's going to be a collection of papers that relate in some way to evolution, justice, and the law. And we've got a fantastic collection of authors. So my contribution to this paper has been, to this issue has been a paper about why stereotypes of criminality are confounded with stereotypes of race. So why do we in America have stereotypes about people's likelihood to engage in criminal behavior that are tied to race? Or to put it more plainly, in America, why do we stereotype Black Americans as more likely to engage in criminal behavior, to be physically aggressive, to be violent, etc.? And what I argue in my paper is that these stereotypes are actually linked back to ecology that I talked about earlier. And the reason is because in America, race and ecology are confounded with one another, in that Black Americans are more likely to live in relatively desperate ecologies as compared to white Americans, and white Americans are more likely to live in relatively hopeful ecologies as compared to Black Americans. And so what I argue in this paper is that people will use race as a cue to ecology, and then stereotype Black Americans as being more likely to possess faster life history strategies, so to be more impulsive, more risk-taking, and engage more in criminal behavior. And so it is not inherently about race. There is nothing about being Black that makes you more likely to commit crime than being white or Asian or Latino or whatever. That instead, what affects people's propensity for crime is ecology, and our stereotypes track that information. So in this paper, what I wanted to show was that you can wipe out the effects of race stereotyped crime by presenting information about ecology. So if I asked participants, how likely is it that a Black American is to commit a drug offense? So drug possession with the intent to sell, for example. Then just given that information, my participants might say more likely as compared to a white individual. But if I say, imagine a Black individual who is from a resource stable and predictable environment, how likely are they to commit drug possession with intent to sell? No difference. And how likely as compared to a white person from the same environment. And in fact, people stereotype a white person from a desperate environment as being just as likely to commit drug possession with intent to sell as a Black individual from that environment. So the race effects, when you present ecology information, go away. So it really does seem like it's tied to these inferences about ecology and not about race.
Mm-hmm. But I asked you about perceptions of criminal behavior, but is it that in your work you are in any way interested in understanding why certain kinds of behavior are classified as criminal and not others, even though others might also be non-normative, let's say, for example? Or is that something that doesn't really interest you so much?
I certainly think it's an interesting question. It's one that I personally haven't done any research on, but I know that there is work out there that tries to define sort of what is abnormal and what counts as deviations, but it's not work that I personally have been involved in.
Okay, so going back to your work, when and why do people endorse specifically the death penalty? And of course, this is another sensitive topic.
Yes, I'm really excited about this research. I am in the process of developing some studies right now to follow up on the paper that already exists. So thank you for asking me about it. I'm really excited to talk about it. So the previous work on the death penalty people's attitudes towards the death penalty has primarily been focused on very proximate explanations. So focused on things like political ideology. If you are more conservative, then you're more likely to endorse the death penalty than if you're more liberal, or have looked at sort of cultural effects, like if you are a tight culture or a loose culture in terms of your tolerance for deviance, then tight cultures are more likely to have the death penalty than loose cultures. That's work by Michelle Gelfand.
But here in distinguishing between conservatives and liberals, are you in any way applying, for example, moral foundations theory or not?
So not directly. Moral foundations theory would make similar predictions about conservatives being more concerned about specific types of infractions that might lead to the death penalty.
Okay.
So I think that is certainly a connection. But what my work was interested in was in looking at resource availability. So if we think that resources are scarce versus if we think that resources are really available, does that affect our attitudes towards the death penalty? Right. And is it the case that in places where resources are scarce versus available, are they more or less likely to have the death penalty? And we thought that resources would be related to this. This is work I did also with Ashley Votruba. And so we were interested in whether there might be an evolved inclination to prefer elimination-focused punishments when resources are scarce. Because when resources are scarce, your group is already kind of in a precarious position, and someone in the group does something wrong, you have two choices. You can either give them another chance, or you can kick them out. And the argument is that when resources are scarce, the kicking them out prevents you from the possibility of them offending again, which would be the worst thing that could happen. So you could make the error of keeping someone around who you shouldn't, or of kicking someone out who you shouldn't. And when resources are scarce, keeping around someone you shouldn't is the more costly error. So we don't want to make it. So we're more willing to eliminate the individual. That was our logic for why we thought this would happen. So we started looking at globally, countries around the world, on whether or not they had the death penalty, and then our proxy measure for resource availability, which was the Human Development Index, which is an index developed by the United Nations that is a good measure for how many resources are available in a country. And what we found was that countries that have lower Human Development Index, so fewer resources, were more likely to have the death penalty on the books as a possible punishment. Then we looked within just the United States. In the US, there is a setup where each of the 50 states gets to decide for themselves whether or not they have capital punishment. So some states have it and some states don't. And we looked at the state per capita income as a measure for resources, as well as state life expectancy. And what we found was that states that have lower per capita income and lower life expectancy were more likely to have the death penalty. So we had some correlational evidence to start with that suggested this relationship between resources and capital punishment. What we wanted to do next was to look at this experimentally. So we manipulated participants to either think that resources were scarce or available by showing them a slideshow of images with words talking about the economy either being really great or really bad. And then we asked them their death penalty attitudes. So how much do they think the death penalty is necessary, how much they like it and want to keep it, those kinds of things. And we found that the participants who were primed with resource scarcity reported more favorable attitudes towards the death penalty. So they actually increased in how willing they were to use the death penalty against an offender. And then we later, in another experiment, found that the mediating mechanism, what is actually driving that effect, is that people become less willing to risk repeated offenses. So when resources are scarce, we're not willing to risk that you could offend again. And so we want to use the death penalty.
Mm-hmm. Uh, is it that the death penalty is more common in the southern states? And I'm going to explain why I'm asking that, but is it the case or not?
Yes, it is.
So, and if it is, do you think that what you're exploring here would connect in any way to the work done by people like, for example, Richard Nisbet, that is more a sort of cultural transmission to explain the differences in behavior, even toward the criminal justice system between the southern states and the northern states, or even Randy Thornhill's, that is a more biologically driven pathogen stress kind of a theory. Do you think that it could connect in any way to that or not?
Yeah, I do think that there are some connections between what Richard Nisbet, I believe, and Dov Cohen have talked about as the honor culture in the South. I think that that is inherently tied to conservatism. And it's really interesting that you bring up the work on disease prevalence, because one thing that Ashley Votruba and I tested in our study was whether a disease prime would do the same thing as a resource scarcity prime. And we found that it didn't. That concern about disease didn't actually increase people's willingness to use the death penalty. So it seems like it might be specific to resources, but I do think that resources are tied in together with these ideas of cultures of honor and conservatism and so forth. I think they're related concepts for sure.
Yeah, of course. And here in explaining where honor culture comes from, in the US particularly, there's these two sort of conflicting views, Nisbet versus Thornhill's, one more culturally driven, the other more biologically driven. But yeah, it's still, I guess that the jury is still out on which of them is the right or more right, let's say, than the other. So, talking now about friendships. So, what do we look for in a friend? Who do we want to have as friends?
Yes, moving from when do we kill people to
Yeah, it's an interesting transition. I like these kinds of transitions on my show. So.
Yes, I am also very interested in research related to friendship, and this is work that I have been doing with Jamie Krems, and we have been exploring what people prefer in their same-sex friends. And what we have argued is that friendships have helped to solve challenges across evolutionary history for both men and for women, but the types of challenges, the exact challenges, may have differed a little bit on what friendship was doing for men and for women. And so the idea is that this might influence the kinds of qualities that men and women prefer in their same-sex friends. And so we did a number of studies. The first where we just asked people about their preferences for an ideal same-sex best friend. So how important it was that their best friend possessed a bunch of different qualities, and people could say that they wanted all of them if they were going to. We didn't constrain them on that. And then in the second study, we asked about the qualities that their actual same-sex best friend possessed. So here, no longer could they get everything they wanted. They were having to deal with the actual person and the qualities that that person possessed. And then in our third study, we gave people a budget of friend dollars that they could spend towards different kinds of traits in a same-sex best friend. And what we found across these three studies was some similar patterns in the preferences that men and women had for their friends. So for example, well, first I want to say that overall, I think the takeaway point is that men and women actually have very similar preferences for their friends, the qualities that they prefer in friends, which makes sense because the challenges that friendships have helped to solve have been very overlapping for men and for women. So just like with mate preferences, we see a lot of similarities between men and women, but we do see some differences. And so men, when compared to women, more highly valued same-sex friends who were physically formidable, who were higher status, who had wealth, and who could help them to potentially attract mates. Whereas women, compared to men, more highly valued friends who provided emotional support and intimacy and shared useful social information with them. So we did see some differences that we would predict from a functional account of friendship.
Mm-hmm. And is it that sometimes we like to have vicious friends?
Yes, absolutely. So this is work that is led by Jamie Krems. I think it's really fantastic research because it looks at friendship preferences in a way that is target specific, which is something that nobody else has done yet. So to break that down, what I mean when I say that is that when we talk about wanting a particular quality, so say we want generous friends, what we really mean is we want friends who are generous to us. And so that's the piece that has been missing from previous research, is that target specificity. And so we want friends who are generous to us, not friends who are generous to our enemies. That would be bad. And so similarly, we want friends who are vicious to our rivals, right, just not to us. So what we want in friends depends on the target that we're talking about. And so sometimes, in fact, it is helpful for our friends to be vicious instead of generous.
Right. So when we think about jealousy, we usually think about it applied to, of course, romantic relationships. But is there also friendship jealousy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the research question that Jamie Krems and I and our colleagues were interested in studying here was essentially, how do we feel when our friends become close to other people? Because we know in the romantic relationships context, as you said, we know a lot about jealousy, about what happens when we think that someone is trying to poach our mate. But people hadn't looked at this in a friendship context before. But friends are also limited in number and very valuable to us. And so if we have this valuable relationship, it would make sense that we would want to protect it. And friendship jealousy is one way in which it's a tool that helps us to protect those valuable relationships. Mm-hmm. So jealousy in a friendship context is about loss to a third party. It's not about, you move away and so you don't see your friend anymore, which would be loss alone. It's about your friend gets close to this other person and is closer to them now than they were to you. And it is calibrated to the extent to which we value a particular friend. So we feel much more friendship jealousy towards our close friends than towards people that we care less about. And it's also importantly calibrated to this idea of being replaced. So it's not necessarily how much time your friend is spending with another person. For example, if your friend gets a new romantic partner, they're probably going to spend a lot of time with that person. Maybe more time than they spend with you. It's likely more time that they spend with you. Yeah. But you don't feel jealousy in that situation because presumably you occupy a different niche than that romantic partner does. You're not offering the same things to your friend that romantic partner is. So you don't worry about them replacing you because you're different. It's instead when that friend becomes friends with somebody else that you worry that your niche is threatened and that your position as a friend is threatened and you feel the jealousy. So the other piece in this paper that I think is really interesting is that feeling friendship jealousy motivates friend guarding behaviors. So just like people have mate guarding behaviors where, they hover around their partner at the party and to try and deter would-be poachers, friends actually do things to deter friend poachers too. And so one of the examples of something like this that I think is pretty ubiquitous, you've probably seen it, is people have like best friend necklaces or t-shirts.
Yeah.
And that is a visual way of advertising that you are someone's close friend and deterring other people from interfering with your relationship. So people actually do engage in these friend guarding behaviors similarly to how they guard their romantic partners.
I just laughed when you mentioned the term friend guarding strategies or behaviors, because I was just about to ask you if, as we have mate guarding behaviors in romantic relationships, as we know from the work by David Buss and others, if there would be the same for friendships. And that's why I laughed. But yeah, you already answered that question. So, okay, so one last question then. Are there sex differences in friendship jealousy? I mean, is it that men and women become jealous about their friends for different reasons and in different ways?
So both men and women feel friendship jealousy. We see evidence for it for both men and for women. And they feel it under the same circumstances, that it's when their friend is potentially being poached by another person. They're going to feel it. But men, interestingly, show more friendship jealousy over the prospective loss of an acquaintance, whereas women show more friendship jealousy over the prospective loss of a close friend. So that is one difference. And then also, men and women's friendship structures tend to differ in that women prefer these really close dyadic bonds, so just one-on-one friendships, whereas men tend to have these more loose multi-male groups as friendships. And so what that suggests is that women stand to lose more from the loss of any one particular friend than men do. It's like, do you invest 90 points in one person and 10 points in the other versus 35 in one person and 30 in another and 20 in another, etc.? Then obviously if you are threatened with losing the person you put 90 points into, that's way worse than if you are threatened just with losing someone that you put 25 points into. So we did predict that women would experience more friendship jealousy, and we have some studies that do bear that out.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I have a profile on Google Scholar that I try to keep updated, and I would also encourage people, if they are ever having trouble finding the PDF of an article, to email me, please. I am more than happy to send the articles for free so that you don't have to worry about stuff being behind a paywall. So please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about my work.
Great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larson, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Spinha, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saim Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morton Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Harrington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N. And special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.